Isaiah chapter 39 ends with Hezekiah getting a visit from envoys from far off Babylon. It seems now he's world famous. He's a world famous king. He had held off a complete destruction of his country by the Assyrian army and the Assyrian Empire. And in 2 Chronicles 32 it says that Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, went home in shame. He's the first king, the first country to bring shame on top of Assyria. And Hezekiah was exalted in the sight of all the nations after that. All the nations of the world knew about King Hezekiah. Hezekiah was exalted, and then Hezekiah recovered from a deadly illness. They all knew he was going to die, and then all of a sudden he prayed to his God and he got better. But Hezekiah gave no return for the benefit he received because his heart was proud. Therefore wrath came upon him and on Judah and Jerusalem. So everything changes. And right here at the end of chapter 39, we find out that the Babylonians are eventually going to come. Hezekiah was pleased, and he showed them all the treasure of his house, the silver and the gold and the spices and the precious oils, and the whole armory was found in his treasuries. And there was nothing in his house or in his dominion that Hezekiah did not show them. So these guys came from far off Babylon. They came to see Hezekiah, and Hezekiah started showing them everything. All his treasure, all his whole armory, all his treasuries, all his house, all his dominion. Hezekiah then became arrogant. He didn't give any credit to what God had done. God had saved him from the Assyrians. God had saved him from a deadly disease. And there was nothing that he didn't show them. And this wasn't just a courtesy call. This is another country that's sending their envoys to come and to visit with this king for some diplomatic reason. Jerusalem was to be a light to the nations. Here comes the nations. And Hezekiah didn't show them the God. Hezekiah then turned around and showed them himself and his stuff. And that's the same mistake that Moses made. Remember when Moses got angry and Moses gathered the assembly before the rock, and he said to them, "Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock?" And it wasn't God that he gave credit to, but he was angry and he is tired, and he took the credit for himself, and that's why he didn't get to go into the land. Now, it doesn't look like a big deal, because this is brown here is the Assyrian Empire. There's Assyria, the country, but their empire spread from Egypt all the way up north of Israel, all the way to the east. It just covered this great big huge territory. So Jerusalem, where Hezekiah is right over here. Babylon's right over here, and it's in the Assyrian Empire too. It's just a little place. It kind of has its own government, but it's still ruled by the Assyrian Empire. So it's a 900-mile journey that these guys made. Babylon's just a weak, small, unimportant vassal of the Assyrian Empire. But Hezekiah has shown that Assyria could be held off. But Isaiah came and told him, "What have you done? What have you done? What did you show these people?" I showed them everything. I showed them the treasuries. I showed them the military equipment that I had. I showed them everything. And I called it all of mine. And Hezekiah said, "Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and all that is in your fathers, that your fathers have laid up in store to this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing will be left. And some of your sons who will issue forth from you, whom you will beget, will be taken away, and they will become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon." What's the importance of the sons of Hezekiah?
The Messianic line.
The David line. The seed. The seed has to come from David. Now, all the seeds of David, they're going to Babylon. They're not even going to be in Jerusalem anymore. This is a big problem. This isn't just your grandkids are going to be gone. This is the seed of David is going to be gone. Hezekiah has more responsibility here than just to Hezekiah. It's to the covenants and to the promise of God. And so we want to look at our, we go back to chapter 7 and chapter 8. When God said that the northern kingdom would be swept away by the Assyrians. But remember he said, when this wave of water comes down there, it's only going to come up to Judah's neck. And that's what happened. All the major cities were destroyed by Assyria and Sennacherib. But Judah and Jerusalem still stayed intact, and they were able to drive him off. It was horrible. What happened was horrible, but it didn't destroy Judah. But now it does. So that promise back then was to Ahaz, but now the promise is to Hezekiah. So we want to look at our timeline one more time, and we look at Hezekiah's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson, Jehoiachin. He's the first one that got carried off. So it's not going to happen for a long time. And when the book of Daniel begins, it says, then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of the officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some from the royal family and of the nobles. That royal family, according to the old King James Version, is literally the king's seed. We're back to the story of the seed. Our translations don't help us out a lot. I think they're real good at translating, but they don't know the Bible story. Anytime that seed comes up, if it's the seed of the woman, if it's the seed of David, if it's the promised seed, you need to put that in the translation. The old King James did, and I think the ESV, I think the English Standard Version did. One of the other ones did. It wasn't just that it was the royal family. It was the seed of the king. And that's what happened. He took them out, took out the seed of the king. And so, now among the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them to be Daniel. He assigned the name Belshazzar, Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. That's where those guys came from. They're descendants of the king. They're in the line of the seed, and they're in Babylon. And they're under the rule of a foreign, pagan king. Satan is winning. That's a big story. That's what's happening there. But now, in Isaiah, we see the promise that future there's going to be a destruction from Babylon, and they're going to be carried off. And we see that at the very last verse of chapter 39. But when we turn the page to chapter 40, it's 150 or 200 years later. And the promise that he's talking about then is still looking forward. So the exile's over, and Isaiah starts talking about the return on the next page. He says, comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak kindly to Jerusalem and call out to her that her warfare has ended, that her iniquity has been removed, that she has received of the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice is calling, clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness, make smooth the desert, the highway of our God. Two things you need to notice when we do this. One of them has really confused me forever as to what on earth is Isaiah talking about. First of all, Isaiah skipped a bunch. He skipped a bunch. There's a whole bunch of stuff he left out. But number two, Isaiah's not there. Isaiah is prophesying this. He's telling this is going to happen. He's looking toward the future as if it is the past. And Isaiah's not there. And he skipped 150, 200, 800 years. He skipped a lot of time. Now, if you go to the movies and you're watching a movie and you see these 1950s cars there, you see that yellow car there in the left corner? I had one of those. 63 T-Bird right there, buddy. So you look there and you see this old time. You see this old time picture there. And then in the next scene, something's changed. Now we're looking way into the future. And if somebody doesn't let you in on what's going on, and the movies will do that. A lot of times we're watching the movies and somebody goes out to get a sandwich, and on the screen it'll go 150 years later. And then you come back and you go, what's going on? Where do these guys come from? You have to know that detail. I never knew that detail, so I had trouble reading Isaiah. Isaiah 39 ends with Judah will be carried to Babylon, and you turn the page, it's 150 or more years later, and there's a call and a promise for them to return. You have to know that when you read Isaiah, and it changes. Now, what happens is the Bible skeptics then say Isaiah might have written the first 39 chapters, but somebody else a long, long time later wrote the rest of the book. So the skeptics go in there and say, this must have been written like 200 years before Jesus, and a bunch of guys got together and compiled it together and added it on to Isaiah. Now, if you remember back in our very first class in Mark, we took a short look at what source criticism is in our Bible and how it invented different sources of theories on how Mark got his information and how the gospel accounts came to be. Where did they get their information? And if you remember, we talked about the fake Q gospel that they said they found and the other ones that must have been written in Aramaic, and they had all these theories and everything where Mark got his information. And we saw that it mostly originated with the liberal German theologians of the 18th century. And this is known as the German Enlightenment. All of a sudden, these guys knew all these things. Well, the same thing happened to Isaiah by the same people that did it to Mark. So Isaiah is now writing about something that he didn't live to see, so the theory is he must not have written it. Somebody else wrote it. And it's called the Deutero-Isaiah theory. And that just means the second Isaiah. And what happens is every time you read a commentary, even a conservative commentary that believes that Isaiah wrote it all, they still call it that. That name is stuck to all of that. When you read that and you're going, what does this guy believe? Well, he doesn't believe that, but that's the name that's on that, and that's the name that's stuck on that right now. So Isaiah is writing about something that he didn't live to see, and so they assign it the fact that he couldn't have known what he was talking about. And there was two main German scholars, Johann Eichmann and Johann Doderlin. These two guys kind of got together and they put that together. This guy right here, I think he's the big problem. He's also the guy that came up with the original theory of the lost gospel for Mark, that there must be some other gospel there that Mark got his source from. He came up with the Aramaic hypothesis. He laid the groundwork for Julius Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis that Moses didn't write the first 5 books. So he came to the Bible as a theologian, teaching in theological seminaries, and he didn't believe the Bible, and he infiltrated that into all the German theologians. And these guys all knew each other. Now, why don't you read a little bit about this guy so we can see what he's doing. Eckhart has been called the founder of modern Old Testament criticism. Not a scholar, not an expositor, but a critic. If you're going to look at it and say, find something the matter with it, that's what he got paid to do. He recognized its scope and problems and began many of the most important discussions. And he said, my greatest trouble was that I had to bestow on a hitherto unworked field on the investigation of the inner nature of the Old Testament with the help of the higher criticism, which isn't new to humanists. So in other words, we've had this humanist idea where we could criticize all these other writings and things, but nobody had ever done it to the Bible. So he's like taking credit for being the first guy to ever do this to the Bible. His investigations led him to the conclusion that most of the writings of the Old Testament have passed through several hands. So that's the theory. That's the theory that they have on there. That these guys didn't originate. Isaiah didn't think this up. Mark didn't think this up. None of these, Moses didn't think this up. A whole bunch of other people thought this up, and these guys signed their name to it. And he took for granted that all of the supernatural events related to the Old and New Testaments were explainable by natural principles. He sought to judge them from the standpoint of the ancient world and to account for them by the superstitious beliefs which were generally in vogue. He did not perceive in the biblical books any religious ideas of much importance for modern times, and they interested him merely historically and for the light they cast upon antiquity. Just a hobby to him. just a hobby to him. So again, we have these so-called theologians giving criticisms of the text rather than an exposition of the text. And him and a lot of other guys have infected biblical scholarship for over 200 years. They cast doubt and suspicion on the Bible text and the Bible stories. And he's the first one who said that Mark must have gotten his information from someplace else. He worked on the documentary hypothesis with Wellhausen that said Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, and he tried to destroy any belief in Isaiah as being an inspired writer. So these guys begin with the conclusion that the Bible is not the Word of God, and then they get paid to teach this to other theologians. I want to look at 4 things. 4 things to help us through this. If you're ever a person that's run into this, 4 ideas. First of all, the New Testament quotes both parts of Isaiah. If we're going to believe in the New Testament, we have to believe that Isaiah wrote both parts of it. The second part of Isaiah is the first thing that Mark quotes as his gospel. You have to do away with Mark if you're going to do away with Isaiah. And if you do away with Isaiah, you have to do away with Mark. That's why this guy worked on both of them. So the simple answer is Mark said Isaiah wrote Isaiah. But of course, Icahn and the critics and the sources say Mark didn't write Mark either, so it doesn't make any difference. Do you see how they've undermined everything? But this, the second half of Isaiah, is where Mark begins. Saying Isaiah didn't write, it casts the doubt on Mark and on the rest of the New Testament. And saying Mark got his information from some unknown sources, the entire Bible is cast into doubt, and it's taught in many seminaries and Christian universities that way today. And I don't even think they realize the damage that they're doing. So in Luke, the 4th chapter, about the 14th verse, Jesus goes into the synagogue. And in those days in the synagogue, there wasn't a priest or anything like that. There was a guy that was the head of the synagogue who may not even teach there or read there. He just took care of everything. And then somebody would hand a man who had been to synagogue and had learned this all his life, and he was over 30 years old, they would hand him something to read. So Jesus walks in, and they hand him the scroll of Isaiah. And Jesus unrolls that thing to chapter 61, which is the second half of Isaiah that they said Isaiah didn't write. It's the Deutero Isaiah that Jesus reads from. And when he gets done reading it, he closed the book and he gave it back to the attendant and he sat down and everybody was looking at him because of the way he read it. When he read that, it sounds like you're talking about yourself. And he began to tell them, today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. He was reading about himself. And he's reading about it from the second half of Isaiah, almost to the end of Isaiah. And he said, this is talking about me. Jesus reads it. Jesus says it's Scripture. Jesus says it's Isaiah. And then he says, not only that, it's about me. He's fulfilling the coming of Jesus. Now we're getting a better idea of how to read Isaiah, because Isaiah is kind of hard to read if you don't know the end. And remember in the 8th chapter of Acts, Philip was told to go meet this official from the Queen of Ethiopia. This Ethiopian nobleman, he'd gone to Jerusalem. He was on a long road back to North Africa. And while he was riding along, he's reading from the book of Isaiah. And he was returning and sitting in his chariot, and he was reading Isaiah. And Philip ran up to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet. And he said, do you understand what you're reading? I know a guy that was a preacher. He was kind of a weird guy. He was on a bus one time, and a guy was sitting there reading the Bible. And this preacher walked up and says, understandest thou what thou readest? And the guy said, get away from me. So Luke tells us he was reading from Isaiah. Philip hears him reading from Isaiah, and Philip recognizes the passage. It's from the Deutero Isaiah part, chapter 53. And Philip says, do you understand what you're reading? He goes, no, I don't. I'm not sure who he's talking about. Is he talking about himself? Is he talking about somebody that died a long time ago? Somebody that's coming in the future? I don't know who he's talking about. And so how can you have a guy that's supposed to be the Messiah? He's supposed to be the king. He's supposed to be the sacrifice. He's supposed to be deity. He's supposed to be a suffering servant. Who's he talking about? It doesn't make any sense. And Philip says, oh, it's Jesus. And he begins at that passage and starts teaching Jesus from the second half of the book of Isaiah. It was written, now the new guys say, or these critics say, that it was written 200 years before Jesus, rather than 700 years before Jesus, as Isaiah lived. So it's 200. I don't care if it was written 15 minutes before Jesus was born. There's a miracle there. He's telling the future. That's what I used to, when I taught Daniel years and years ago, I said, I don't care if Daniel wrote it the night Jesus was born. I don't care if he wrote that then. It was still a miracle because Jesus points back to the thing. It doesn't matter. But it was written a long time ago, and it gave these people a long time to read and to stew and to think about it. No matter the source criticisms, you still have to deal with the miraculous. Now, the gospel, according to John, Jesus quotes Isaiah 53 himself in the second half there. And John says, these things Isaiah said because he saw his glory and he spoke of him. John comes right out. Jesus said, this is talking about me. And John says, the reason Isaiah wrote this thing because he saw Jesus' glory. And that's why he wrote it. So we have to look at this and see that there's a miraculous thing here. The New Testament says Isaiah wrote it. So that's the first thing. The second thing, in 1948, when they were digging around and they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found an entire scroll of Isaiah that was completely intact and rolled up in a jar. This thing's 22 feet long. It was all one piece. It was actually 17 pieces of sheepskin. They were all stretched out, it was written, and they were sewed together. And chapter 39 ends, and on that same line, chapter 40 begins. This is the oldest. This is maybe 400 years before Jesus, maybe 200 years before Jesus. So they found this scroll. This scroll is actually in a museum right now over in, it's called the Great Isaiah Scroll, and it's kept in the Shrine of the Book in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem in a special underground climate-controlled vault. Hardly anybody ever gets to see it. Like, I think 10 years ago, they brought it out and put it on display for a couple days and put it back in there because it's so fragile. It's the oldest copy of the book of Isaiah. And what's really unique about it is before that time, the oldest copy that they had of Isaiah was 1,000 years later. Was 1,000 years later. So from the time that they think that the Isaiah scroll was written to the time that they had the oldest one at that time was 1,000 years. And there was no difference between them. They'd been copied and copied and copied and copied and copied and copied and copied, and they had the same thing in the Hebrew text. They were both Hebrew texts. So, we know the oldest thing we got about Isaiah, it's all one book from a long, long time ago. Third, and we already looked at this a little bit, Isaiah left instructions to his disciples. Isaiah said, I wrote some things down so my disciples could read it later. For example, in chapter 8, it says, Then the Lord said to me, take for yourself a large tablet and write on it in ordinary letters. So this was so everybody could see it. Write it out in Hebrew, take a large tablet, make it big. He had this thing written out. And then he said, bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples. And I will wait for the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will even look eagerly for him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are for signs and wonders in Israel, and for the Lord of hosts who dwells on the mountain. And then in chapter 29, he says, the entire vision will be like to you words in a sealed book, which when they give it, is to one who is literate will say, please read it because I cannot read. And the book will give one to who is illiterate saying, please read this. And he will say, I cannot read. They're not going to understand it, but it's going to be written down. And one other place, and I think this is the most important one. He says, now go, write it on a tablet before and inscribe it on a scroll, that it may serve in the time to come and a witness forever. So it's to serve as a time to come. And that time to come is the Babylonian captivity. Those people need that book. It's a call to return. It's to give hope to the exiles. But also, it's a witness forever. Isaiah says, I'm writing an eternal book here. I'm writing a book that is important forever. It was important for Jesus and his apostles. It was important for those guys that were on the road to Emmaus. It was important to the Ethiopian. It was important to all the Jewish nation. It's important to all Gentiles, and it's important for us today because we're studying the gospel according to Mark, which he said is the gospel according to Isaiah. This book is important. It serves as a witness to Jesus and to the gospel. And it shows us different things about the king, about his suffering, being a suffrate servant, that he's a substitution in the atonement, that he's pierced for our transgressions. All of these things come out in the second half of the book. So the second half of the book may be the most important half. It's actually been called by some as the fifth gospel. And that brings us to the fourth point. What's his purpose? What's the purpose of Isaiah? Isaiah wrote this for when he was gone and the nation was taken off the land so that they could still have hope in the promises of God and see the future of God's plan and what it is he's working out. So Isaiah said in chapter 8 to Ahaz, Assyria will not completely destroy Judah and Jerusalem. But now in the 39th chapter we find out Babylon will. So it's going to come to pass that this is going to end. But Isaiah predicted that, and now they can have hope in the future. And that's why Isaiah was such an important book and called the Queen of the Prophets. We've got a lot of prophecy books, but this is the most important. So think of it this way. Judah gets taken off the land, stage by stage, drug off into Babylon, and they try to destroy their religion. And they have the Pentateuch with them. They have the book of Genesis. They know where they came from. They have the book of Leviticus. They know what they're supposed to do. They have the book of Numbers. They have the book of Deuteronomy. What good is the book of Leviticus to them? There's no temple. There's no altar. There's no bronze laver to wash the priests. There's no Ark of the Covenant. That's what's being talked about in the book of Leviticus. They've got the book of Leviticus there. It's not much help to them because they can't do any of the things that are commanded in that book. And there's no record that they ever had a Passover while they were in that land. They didn't own their own sheep, especially when they first got there. But when they returned, it said the sons of Israel who returned from the exile and all those who had separated themselves from the impurity of the nations and the land to join them to seek the Lord, the God of Israel, ate Passover. They took those other books with them, but they also took the book of Isaiah. Eichmann said they didn't have it. Isaiah said, take it with you. Isaiah says they needed it. They needed that book more than they needed the book of Leviticus because Isaiah predicted the exile and the promise and the return and the eventual glory of Jesus Christ. But these promises and these prophecies could not be completely filled by any mortal man. And Isaiah didn't put in a time period. Remember back in chapters 7 and 8, he put these time periods in. By the time this child knows right from wrong, and then a few years later, he says, by the time this child can say mommy and daddy. And we saw, well, that's like 13 years or something until they're destroyed. And then later, it's like a couple years, and it's going to be, there was a time period. There's none of that in this. There's no ending time when this is going to take place. He does mention Cyrus, that's going to take place as return, so they know that happens. But as far as saying this is going to go on for this long, or this is going to, there's no ending time. And so what happened to Israel was they kept reading it. To their credit, 800 years later, when Jesus and John the Baptist show up, they were still reading it. They were still waiting for the conclusion of the book of Isaiah. I find that absolutely amazing because there was a Messiah, there was a branch, there was a son of David, there was a king who was a servant, there was a redeemer who suffers. He's divinity. He's afflicted by divinity. And even after they returned, they're still looking for that. Even in Jesus' day, they've been reading Isaiah for 400 years. They've been reading Isaiah for 400 years. And that's why Jesus and the New Testament authors quote Isaiah. finally, it has finally happened. Isaiah was not fulfilled nor understood until Jesus died and was raised. So Isaiah wrote of the coming judgment and the hope and sealed it up, passed it on to his students and his disciples as a witness forever. Isaiah died waiting for God to vindicate these words. After Hezekiah, his son Manasseh is believed to have stuck him in a hollow log and sawed him in two. Ahaz burned his brother. His son killed him, according to legend. And they think that's what Hebrews 11 is talking about, that some of the prophets were sawn in two. They think it was Isaiah. Put him in a log and cut him in half. Because his own son didn't like the preaching. Hezekiah's own son didn't like that preaching. So chapters 1 through 39 were designed to show us of Isaiah's predictions of judgment and of hope that were to be fulfilled in the exile, and to show us he was a true prophet. And after the exile was over, Isaiah's disciples opened the scroll and they began to read and apply his words to the hope for their day, in the hope of the return, that there would be a king, the branch, the kingdom, the redemption, the suffering servant. And they had trouble putting that together. But they didn't succeed, because most of the Jews did not return. 90% of the Jewish people in Jesus' day never came back to the land. They were scattered all over the world. They didn't make it back. There was no king. There was no kingdom. There was no promise of the son of David on a throne. It didn't happen. They never again ruled themselves with their own king. Never. They never had another kingdom. And the Lord had not descended on the temple as he did on the tabernacle in Moses or on the temple of Solomon. Remember, the Lord descended and they couldn't go in there because of the smoke. They came back and built another temple, and that didn't happen. It has never happened. God never came back to us. There was no Ark of the Covenant. In fact, Jeremiah 3:16 says they're never even going to look for it anymore, although they are. And those that did return are still ruled by the Persians, by the Medes, then by the Greeks, and then shortly before Jesus shows up, by the Romans. They never ruled themselves. And now there's a pagan king. When Jesus shows up, there's a pagan king who's sitting on the throne of David, seeking to kill the seed. He is Satan himself. Herod is an evil person. The promise of the eternal throne of David, the call at the end of 2 Chronicles, the ending of Malachi, the prophecies of Daniel, Isaiah's message. If you won't listen to God, he won't talk. And he didn't talk for 400 years. But to their credit, they kept reading the books that they had. Now, come down to Jesus' day, and there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. And this man was righteous, and he was devout, and he was looking for the consolation of Israel. That's the word that Isaiah 40 starts with. Comfort, comfort my people. Isaiah uses the verb form. He gives it a name. It's a noun. The comfort is a person. And somehow Simeon knew that. That's the first word in Isaiah 40. And old Simeon is looking for that promise. He's looking for the noun of the promise of the verb, comfort. And it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death until he had seen the Lord's Christ. And he came in the Spirit into the temple. And when the parents brought the child Jesus to carry out for him the custom of the law, then he took him in his arms and blessed God. I want to see him. You can hold him. You got to hold him. And then he said, now, Lord, you are releasing your bondservant to depart in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light, the revelation to the Gentiles. So he starts out quoting Isaiah 40, and he ends quoting Isaiah 9, which we spent quite a bit of time on. The glory of the Lord to your people. So Isaiah, that's what John said in John 12, that it was the glory of Jesus that made Isaiah right. Now Philip met Jesus, and he went to Nathanael, and he said, hey, we found him. We found who? We found the guy everybody's been looking for since Isaiah. And Philip said to Nathanael, "We found him whom Moses in the law and also the prophets, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Now we have Zechariah. We've got quite a story in the book of Luke about Zechariah and John the Baptist. It's a longer story than the other ones put in there. And if you start reading when John the Baptist is born, and Zechariah is holding him in his arms. I've been around several parents who had babies recently, and they don't talk about other people's babies. They talk about their baby. They don't care anything about it. I remember when my son Josh had his first baby, and every time they go to the doctor, they give him a percentage. He's in the top 98 percentile of everyone around. My baby's in the top 98 percentile. And the next time he goes, he's in the top 98 percentile in his speech and his walk and his movement. 4 or 5 times, I finally said, "Josh, you were in the 98 percentile too. Just think of what that means." So he's holding this baby in his arms, and he's not talking about his baby. He starts talking about Jesus, who isn't born yet. He just keeps talking about Jesus, talking about Jesus, talking about Jesus, until he gets right down to the very end, and he looks at his own son, his own baby, and this is what he says: "And you, child, you will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord." This is the one. This is the one. And he starts quoting Isaiah 40. It's John the Baptist. My son isn't the one. My son is going to announce that one. Countless people showed up for John's preaching in the wilderness because they remembered that miraculous child that was born 30 years before. And something great was going to happen. And nobody saw him again. He comes wandering out of the wilderness. "Hey, you remember that 30 years ago when that guy couldn't talk and he came out and he named his kid John?" Yeah, I remember that. He's down by the river preaching. Well, let's go. That's why they went out to see John, because he was a miracle baby too, and they showed up. And in Daniel and Jeremiah and 2 Samuel and Psalm 110 and Malachi and 2 Chronicles, they knew the time had to be getting close because of the nations that were mentioned and the time periods that were being talked about in those other prophecies. And here we have the words of the second part of the book of Isaiah that were sealed up by Isaiah. They've not come to pass. They've not been completed. And Israel and John the Baptist in Jesus' day are still reading them the same way for hundreds of years. And they're still looking. They're looking for a conquering king. They're looking for a savior. They're looking for a suffering servant. They're looking for God himself. Some are looking for more than one person. And they're dividing. They're starting different denominations over which one they're supposed to be looking for and who it is. But the nation is in anticipation when Jesus shows up. And that's what Mark is quoting here. He says, "Comfort, O comfort my people, says the Lord. Speak kindly to Jerusalem and call her out. Her warfare is ended. Her iniquity has been removed." This hasn't happened. This is yet future. Passover was given to the Jews so they would remember their freedom from Egypt. And they celebrated that. That was the big holiday. But later on, they had a holiday called Purim. And the holiday of Purim remembers Esther, the time that she saved Israel from the king. And then they have another holiday that is called Hanukkah. And Hanukkah celebrates a time between the Old Testament and the New Testament when the Maccabees got their temple back. So we've got, remember the escape from Egypt, remember the salvation at Esther's time, remember getting the temple back at the Maccabees, but there's no celebration of the return from Babylon exile. No, there's no celebration. It's not marked on the calendar. They don't take a day off of work and celebrate that. And the reason is because it never happened completely. When John the Baptist shows up, it had not been completed, and the people were still looking for it because there was no king. There was no kingdom. And most of the Hebrew people in the world didn't even live in the land of Israel. They didn't have it yet. So they kept looking. The glory of the Lord of the first temple during the vision of Ezekiel left. It's a long drawn, it's like chapters 8 through 11. He left, he went to the wall, he went outside the wall, Eventually he's gone. He never comes back. He never comes back. The glory of the Lord left the temple and never came back. The temple of Jesus' day was built by a pagan. The Ark of the Covenant was not in the temple. The glory and the presence of the Lord was not there until Jesus walked in. That's why Jesus walks into the temple. He looks around and he walks back out. Why would you even put that detail in there? So then Isaiah says, a voice is calling. Clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness. Make smooth in the desert a highway of our Lord. And Mark says, that's happening. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I will send my messenger ahead of you. He will prepare the way, and a voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready for the way of the Lord and make his path straight. That's why he's using that. The second half of Isaiah that they say was written by somebody else, Mark says it was written by Isaiah, and it was written about Jesus. Here he comes. Thanks for coming.